Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, there's still time.
All time has expired, Senator. The question is on the Woods nomination. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed. The question occurs on the Brown nomination.
Ask the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative. Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Cantwell, Casey, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Flake, Franken, Graham, Grassley, Hirono, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, McConnell, Murray, Hall, Reed of Rhode Island, Roberts, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Stabenow, Tester, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Wicker, Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe. Aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. Aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye.
Is anyone wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 90, the nays are 0. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative business. Senate will be in order. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form, prior to a vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to S-815. The Senate will be on order. The senators need to take their conversations out of the well. Senate will come to order. Senators, please take your conversations out of the well. Senate will come to order. Who yields time?
Hey, Tom. Madam President.
Senator from Iowa.
Madam President, the Senate is about to take another historic step. Think about this. 1964 Civil Rights Act. 1990, 23 years ago, I stood here and we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, extending civil rights to people with disabilities. Here we are today now taking one more step to make the American family more inclusive, to ban discrimination once and for all in employment against gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgendered Americans. This is an historic opportunity for the Senate once again to say that we're all members of the American family. No one should be discriminated against because of race, sex, religion, national origin, and they shouldn't be discriminated against because of who they love or who they are or whether they're gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered. This is an historic step for the United States Senate to do today. I urge and I vote on the motion to proceed.
Who yields time in opposition? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 184, S-815, a bill to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S-815, a bill to prohibit employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin. Done. Sure.
You have me down, right?
Yes, sir. Okay. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi.
Murray. Mr. Sharps.
Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe.
I got you. Yeah, I got you.
Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Branken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Bozeman, Coates, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, McConnell, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Thune, and Wicker. Mr. Alexander, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Corker, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte. Aye. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 61, the nays are 30. 3/5 of the Senate duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. No expressions of approval or permitted in the gallery. The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank my colleagues that led this effort on this non-discrimination bill, which was historic, and pleased that we had a bipartisan vote to make America a more accepting and just place, and it's a work in progress, and really pleased that we could find the support on this floor to do that. Now the bill goes to the House, and I urge my colleagues and my congressional delegation and others to look at this bill with an open mind and an open heart and end discrimination in the workplace, and I hope that they will. Mr. President, I'd like to speak about a bill I plan to introduce in just a few moments, and hopefully we'll have some chance or opportunity in the near future to debate it, because it's a very important fix, if you will, to the Affordable Care Act. When we debated this bill for literally years and months in committee for hours and hours and hours in the daylight, during the evening sessions, there were hundreds and hundreds of amendments built. This bill was built with Democratic and Republican support and input. not support. The Republicans did not vote for the bill, but they most certainly had a tremendous amount of impact and in the amendment process. Anyway, building a new health care system for this nation has been very difficult, but it holds a great deal of promise. The Affordable Care Act, in its largest or easiest way to explain it, was somewhere between where some people on the left wanted a government-run system, something like Medicare for all. It's appealing, but it's very expensive. We couldn't figure out a cost-effective way to provide that. Members on the right, more conservative-leaning in this body, wanted to just provide savings accounts, which works beautifully for people who have money to save in the account, but for people who live paycheck to paycheck and there's no money to save, they never get any account to be able to provide for their health insurance. So between those two bookends, we debated for a long time about how to provide a market-based approach for insurance. No nation in the world has attempted this, so this is a big effort. But it's an important effort because we are a developed nation. We need to have a healthy workforce. It's about as simple as that. You can't be number one in the world. You can't be the strongest economic power in the world if your people are sick and weak. It's just about as simple as that. And you can't be the strongest economic power in the world if your health care system is sapping so much money out of your economic power. 19% of the GDP, when Japan is 8%, you can't expect to beat Japan in economics if we're paying almost twice as much for health care and getting less results. So we had to change. So we did, and we built a market-based approach, contrary to what all the opponents of the Affordable Care Act say. We built a market-based approach that basically said, if you're over 65, you're on Medicare, and we're continuing to reform and strengthen Medicare. There are some very good parts of it, and then there's some weaker parts or difficult parts that need to be corrected. And over time, we will continue to streamline, save money, provide better service, more choice, et cetera, et cetera. If you are among the poorest members of our country, 133% of poverty, which is about an income of $15,000 or less, potentially you're just not able to find a good paying full-time job. Perhaps you didn't receive the education that others have received. Perhaps you've got some disability. You would go under this plan on on Medicaid, and then everyone in between the lowest income and the age of 65 is in a private health care system, which is a market-based system, competition, driving prices down. The idea would be that there would be 20, 30, 40 health care plans in every state offered. People can choose what they want with a minimum bronze, silver, gold plan with lots of choice. That is the promise, that is the hope, that is the idea. And the great promise of this is that if you have cancer, you can't be dropped. If you have diabetes, you can't be turned away. So when everyone is covered, the risk is spread, the price comes down, and the free market operates. Now, you'd never know that based on the criticism that you hear on television and radio all day long, but that's the truth. One of the important components of that bill that many of us talked about was the fact that if you had individual insurance on the market, you could keep that. What's happening now, unfortunately, because that grandfather provision in the Affordable Care Act, in my view, this may not be shared by everyone on the floor, but in my view, was not written as tightly as it should have been, as clearly as it should have been. So my bill that I'm introducing today, keeping the Affordable Care Act, Promise Act, keeping the Promise Act, which I'm introducing, will clarify this grandfather clause in the Affordable Care Act so that it will clearly say if you had an insurance plan that you liked, that you could afford, that you felt like felt like that's what you wanted and you could afford, you can keep it. This bill, if it passes, will allow anywhere from 5 to 7 million people who are getting notices like this in the mail every day, and I'm going to read this into the record. This is a letter sent to someone in my state. It says, "Thank you for your support of Vantage healthcare plans over recent years. It's been our pleasure to serve you. We hope you've been satisfied. In light of the recent changes in the healthcare insurance industry, Vantage will be discontinuing our offering of grandfathered individual plans effective January 4th. This discontinuance will affect your policy. Vantage is pleased to announce the availability of several new individual products in 2014. They go on to say, beginning in 2014, you will have the option to enroll in a new plan through the Health Insurance Exchange. Members enrolling through the marketplace may be eligible for premium or cost-share subsidies because everyone in Louisiana with a family income of up to $90,000 a year is going to have some sort of premium support, which is going to be a great help to many of our middle-class families. Many of the marketplace plans will provide you with more generous coverage than your current grandfathered individual plan. We invite you to visit us online to review our exchange. You may also go to www.healthcare.gov. In addition to the exchange plan offerings, you will have several new plan offerings available outside of the exchange. These plans are similar to your Freedom or high deductible plan. We will have information. So this is a letter that thousands of people are getting, and this letter never should have gone out because we said to people, if you had insurance that you liked, you could keep it. We didn't say if you had insurance that you liked that didn't meet the minimum standards or met the minimum standards, you could keep it. We just said, and the President said over and over, if you have insurance and you like the insurance you have, you can keep it. That is what my bill, that's the single focus of my bill. This is not to undermine the Affordable Care Act. It is to strengthen it and to keep our promise to the millions of Americans that we said if you have insurance, you can keep what you have. If you don't, there's going to be this new marketplace where you and your family can go and choose among a variety of different plans and, depending on your income, have support from the community or from the government. And then if you're extremely poor, we can provide options for you through Medicaid, not as desirable as private insurance, but many governors, including some Republican governors, are being very creative with their Medicaid plans and actually changing them into more of a sort of a private-like insurance model. So there's great flexibility in how governors that have good hearts and good intentions are using their Medicaid dollars wisely. But having said that, having reread the grandfather clause, looking at it, very closely, I've determined that this is the best course to introduce this bill, which I will do later this evening to actually file it. And again, it has two simple directives. One, all insurance companies shall continue to offer grandfather plans that were in effect prior to a certain date. And number two, every insurance company that provided those grandfather plans has to explain to those policyholders how their current plan falls short of the new standard on the market and what might be available to them that's better. But they are not forced to buy it. So I hope that we can debate this with the idea, unlike many on the other side, want to tear the act down and repeal it, defund it. They've even taken the whole federal government hostage and the whole economy of the United States hostage. That is what they tried to do. They failed, thank goodness, and the hostages have been released. The government is back up and operating, but there are some of us who are sincere about supporting the concepts of this bill, the promise of this bill, which is extraordinary, really, and historic, but we recognize that there are some pieces of it that need to be fixed or tightened or tweaked to make sure that it's going to work in the future as we have said. So again, that is simply what my bill does. I'm happy to introduce it. I've got one co-sponsor, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, but many others have expressed their interest in working with me on this, and I look forward to bringing this before the committee for full debate and hopefully to the Senate floor in some way in the near future. for debate and hopefully for passage. And I yield the floor. Just the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The procedural vote that the Senate took this evening on the non-discrimination bill for LGBT employees got 61 votes in favor, one vote more than was needed to move the measure forward. 7 Republican senators voted in favor of cloture. They include Senators Ayotte, Hatch, Heller, Kirk, and Portman. The Senate must still vote on the full bill, and if it's approved, CQ roll call writes that the chances of it being brought to the House floor, much less passing in that chamber, are slim. The House companion measure has just 5 Republican co-sponsors, and the spokesman for Speaker John Boehner said today and confirmed that Speaker Boehner opposes the measure. Wanted to read a part of a statement from the White House supporting the non-discrimination bill. The statement reads in part, "Workers should not fear being fired from their jobs, harassed at their workplaces, or otherwise denied the chance to earn a living for themselves or their families simply because of sexual orientation or gender identity." And the legislation would, for the first time in the nation's history, make explicit in federal law such guarantees which are consistent with America's core values of fairness and equality. And the last thing, a passage of this bill is long overdue. That from a statement from the White House. So this evening, the Senate voted to advance the non-discrimination bill for LGBT employees with a vote of 61 to 30. 60 votes were needed. 9 senators were not there for the vote, including 8 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Some of the senators who were not there for the vote, Senators Chambliss, Coburn, McCain, McCaskill, and Vitter. And looking ahead to some of our live coverage tomorrow, when Marilyn Tavenner, the head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, testifies again on the healthcare.gov website and the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. She'll appear before the Senate Health Committee starting at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, live on C-SPAN. We're seeing a number of tweets, including one there from Senator Harkin, talking about the vote in the Senate this evening about ENDA, that non-discrimination bill for LGBT employees. Here's how The Hill is writing about tonight's vote. The Senate voted 61-30 to begin debate on legislation that would create workplace protections for gay and transgender people in all 50 states. That act, called ENDA, received 60 votes needed to overcome a filibuster, but now it will have to move through a series of procedural hurdles before final passage, which is expected later this week. That in The Hill. And we're also seeing some tweets saying that Speaker John Boehner on Monday opposes the Senate legislation. A spokesman says Speaker Boehner does not support the bill because he believes the legislation will increase frivolous litigation and cost Americans jobs, especially small business jobs. We see there a tweet from Representative DeFazio talking about nearly 90% of Fortune 500 companies have policies like ENDA in place. Time for the House to pass ENDA. And what that is about is the Senate today voting 61-30 to advance legislation that would ban workplace discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. In the Senate, 7 Republicans voted in favor of cloture. They are Senators Collins, Ayotte, Hatch, and Heller. Also Senators Kirk, Portman, and Toomey. The White House released a statement about the bill, saying in part that the president supports it because it would establish lasting and comprehensive federal protections against employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. The statement goes on to say this bipartisan legislation is necessary to ensure that strong federal protections exist for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender workers, no matter where they live. That from a statement from the White House.
Mr. President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I understand the chair is ready to announce the conferees for H.R. 3080, the Water Resources Bill.
The chair appoints the conferees on behalf of the Senate.
Senators Boxer, Baucus, Carper, Cardin, Whitehouse, Bitter, Inhofe, and Barrasso.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to calendar 233S42.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 233S42, a bill to provide anti-retaliation protections for antitrust whistleblowers.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the committee reported amendment be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 277 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 277, recognizing the religious and historical significance of the Festival of Diwali.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged, and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President. I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S-Res 285, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 285, authorizing the Committee on Rules and Administration to prepare a revised edition of the standing rules of the Senate as a Senate document.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand that H.R. 3204 has been received from the House and is at the desk.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
H.R. 3204, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes.
I would ask for its second reading and object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, November 5th, 2013, and that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and that following any leader remarks, the Senate resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S-815, the Employee Non-Discrimination Act post-closure, and that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. And finally, that all time during adjournment, recess, and morning business count post-closure on the motion to proceed to S-815.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
So that wraps up today's Senate session. Lawmakers voting to move ahead on non-discrimination legislation for LGBT employees. Senators also approved 2 judicial nominations. More live Senate coverage when the gavel comes down here on C-SPAN 2.